Hey, I'm Pastor Josiah Black, and this is our weekly ongoing Bible study where we have been looking at the book of Habakkuk. We are in chapter 2, and we're just a little bit into that. We'll be looking at verses 6 through 11 today. So we're picking up in the story where we left off last time, which was God has begun to respond to Habakkuk a second time. He's sort of set up this idea that these people who are coming in are indeed wicked, and we're in this period where God is trying to detail to Habakkuk what exactly befalls those who live wickedly. Okay, so trying to make it clear to him in answer to sort of Habakkuk's question of why do you allow this, God had previously implied that because he allows people to have free will, he lets people choose whether they want to walk righteously or not. He doesn't make that choice for them or take away their free will, which obviously complicates things and it leads to people choosing the wrong thing. But in this section of scripture, we're going to get in a little bit to what befalls people who live like that. And I think this is by a way to sort of set up what he's hoping Habakkuk and Israel will learn from seeing these people. So these are verses 6 through 11. Will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, "Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion? How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Because you have plundered many nations, the people who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high, to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your lives. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it." So a few things here, just getting started. Remember, this is, again, God talking about the Babylonians who are coming and answering Habakkuk's question of why do they persist? Why are they allowed to persist? And we get some very specific critiques about what it will be like for them and anyone like them as things sort of go along. So verse 6, will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, "Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long will this go on?" So this is sort of picking up the thought about the enemy. They're talking about the enemy as if it's one person, but that's intended to mean all of the southern nation, right? So the point here is eventually this person is going to be seen for what they are. They're going to be seen as unrighteous. They're going to be seen as not doing the right things. And will not all of them taunt him with ridicule, saying, "Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion? How long must this go on?" So eventually there are going to be people who call out or who challenge the behavior of these people, no matter how mighty they are. There will be woe to those who pile up stolen goods and make themselves wealthy by extortion. This is a very specific critique of the Babylonians who are coming to invade them. However, I do think it's important. I think God is using, again, this example, hoping that Habakkuk and Israel will recognize some of this same behavior in themselves. You know, we've seen that those with power aren't being kind or aren't treating those who don't have it justly. Those with land aren't treating those who don't have it justly. So we're talking about Babylon, but we're not just talking about Babylon here. God's trying to illustrate that that there are similarities that maybe Israel doesn't want to face, even though Babylon is much more powerful and is currently experiencing sort of worldly prosperity. All of these things only lead one place. Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Implication here is if you live this way, if you live the way that these folks have lived, you owe someone something at some point. You know, creditors here very literally is exactly what we're thinking. You know, these are people that might have fronted the money for the war effort. These are people who in Israel's life might be at this time, you know, fronting money for people to borrow and do things, perhaps excesses, whatever it might be. but eventually that's going to come back around. Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Scripture says, then you will become their prey. The implication here is both the direct one, the notion of incurring debts as a nation through this process, but the notion here is also a very poetic way of expressing the people whom you have victimized, the people who you have borrowed from without permission, i.e. steal, right? The people you have stolen from will eventually rise up because people will not stand to be treated that way. And sooner or later, folks are going to come together and there's going to be consequences for you, you being Babylon. So that's intended in verse 7 to sort of capture the cost of making war and the way that they're making war. Verse 8, because you have plundered many nations, the people who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. So this is, again, being a little bit more direct with the point that God's trying to make. Because you have plundered many nations, the people who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood, you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. So the reason Babylonians ultimately collapsed has very much to do with the reign of terror they left behind them, the sort of damage they did as they built their empire. And it's a similar thing to some other empires, not all, but some other empires as they sort of tore through. And a good contrast to this would be Rome. By the time Rome was doing their imperial activity, which was a long time after this one, Rome kind of figured out, and they borrowed this was an evolution of things other people had done or tried, but Rome figured out that the less damage you do when you're conquering a place to non-military stuff, the better things are going to be. The more likely people are going to be to accept your reign, the more submissive people are going to be to your rule, because many of them, just like today, would have just been citizens of these places, right? And in their mind, it's their governments, whomever that might be it a king or be it some other arrangement. Their governments are the ones who make the war. So if you don't make your invasion personal, they won't make it personal either. They'll be able to live with what you bring in. Rome realized that. Babylon at this time was not conducting themselves in that way. They were essentially going scorched earth. They were ruining all these places that they tore through. Sometimes they'd take people up, pick them up and carry them away from their homeland, which would ultimately happen to Israel. And so there are just so many things they're doing that aren't sustainable. Obviously, we want to shy away. There's no sense here that building an empire is something that God condones. But I think in terms of purely human understanding, we can see that there are ways that this works and ways that it doesn't work. And this critique here in verse 8 is God saying to Babylon, hey, listen, let me tell you what the fruit of what you planted is going to be. And that is because you've plundered nations, those people who are left are going to plunder you. They're going to band together. They're going to use their power. They're going to eventually flip things on you, and you'll be the plundered one because of the way you went about doing what you're doing. You've shed human blood. You've destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. So those things have consequences. People remember that, and there will be a reprisal for that. So God's trying to show, again, he's trying to answer Habakkuk by saying, there will be consequences for the way Babylon is working. Don't walk away from here thinking that I, God, am not going to do anything about that, because there will be consequences that are natural just by the way that they're operating. And there will be consequences, eternally because of how they've acted and who I am, okay? Because they are not my people. So those are all things sort of implicit and communicated in this verse. Verse 9, woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. And then verse 10 says, you have plotted the ruin of many people, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. Verse 11, the stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. So in a sense, this is just a restatement, these three verses, of what has already been said. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. So that verse is really just saying, when you build your stuff on unjust gain, you've essentially what Babylon is doing. And I think, again, what some people in Israel have begun to do is take advantage of each other and use that to elevate their position over the people around them. And God here is saying, woe, literally, woe to them. Watch out. Sorrow is coming because of what will happen as a result of this thing. You have plotted the ruin of many people, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The forfeiting your life idea here is important. It's a reemphasis of notions that we now understand a lot better about the cost of sin, right? We know the wages of sin are death. We know the wages of sin are separation of God. And so here God is essentially saying, the way you are living is thoroughly in sin. Even for this portion of time, you're definitely not in alignment with where God would want you to be. And there's not currently fruit of someone who's trying. In fact, the only fruit is seemingly destruction, both what you're visiting on other people and what will ultimately be visited on you. Verse 11, this powerful little phrase, the stones of the wall will cry out and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. This is just a little poetic phrase, but it's intended to capture the idea that all of this will experience these negative things, that God is sort of speaking over them to Habakkuk. So there's no sense that there'll be anything that isn't touched by the consequences of this. It's sort of reinforcing the idea that, okay, you've essentially built your foundation out of rotten wood. In this case, the rotten wood is morally reprehensible exploitation and murder of other people. And here's what's going to happen to houses built on that. And it's not good. So again, this is, I think this is the third or fourth time I've said this, but I want to make it clear. This is primarily a message to Habakkuk from God, explaining what the consequences for Babylon will be, so that the people understand and see that God is not going to let these people go unpunished. That again, there will be both natural consequences to their actions living this way, and that these consequences are God ordained, if not God caused. And further, I think the implication here too is that God would not, he sees these actions for what they are. Even though they're being used right now to his ends, that does not mean he condones the way Babylon has been doing their things. So that's kind of what he's trying to communicate to Habakkuk here. And again, I do believe that there's intended to be a parallel here. You say the Babylonians are so bad. Well, hold the mirror up to yourself a little bit and see that these things are maybe taking place in your community too on smaller scales. You don't have Jewish people raising up their own Babylon at this point, but maybe somebody in the neighborhood's behaving like Babylon towards their neighbors, in the way they're building their own wealth and taking advantage of others. So these are the things I believe in this passage God is hoping that Habakkuk hears and that he considers. So that's all I've got for today. I hope this has been useful and encouraging, maybe. I don't know if this one's exactly encouraging, but I hope at the very least gives you some insight. We continue to get into this response from God to Habakkuk. And I, for one, get a little peace of mind from God saying, no, listen, people who choose to live these ways, there are consequences to that. I don't find glee in that, but there's some comfort to know that there is order and that God has ordained what is a right path and what is a wrong path in many circumstances. And that those are often made clear by the fruit that they bear. So anyway, as always, if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, that's all I've got for this week, and I will see you next week. Thanks as always for joining.